Hello. So my name's Dave Kollen, and aside from Xerces Ambassador, I've done that for about 6 years. Been a member of Xerces for 20 some years. I also am active in the Oregon Bee Atlas, and I'm a master melittologist. That's a program out of OSU Extension, the people that study bees. And I volunteer for a couple of bumblebee atlases, or Pacific Northwest in California. Write some pollinator articles for the Oregon State Federation of Garden Clubs newsletter, Mahonia. So if any of you get that, you might have seen something I've written in there. And that's about it. I retired out of the tech field and got a background in physics, and I just decided I'm going to run the opposite direction for the rest of my life. And so here I am studying bugs. Now I want to say something. When I use the word bug, okay, I'm using it in that kind of common way. There is a specific biological definition, and I'm going to ignore that, okay? So if I say bugs anywhere, I just mean bugs. So everyone, I guess, has maybe heard the term insect apocalypse. How many of you heard of insect apocalypse? Yeah, roughly half or so. And that sounds pretty dire. You know, do we really have an insect apocalypse? Probably not. I mean, not in a true sense, but we have some really worrying things going on. So, you know, if you look at bumblebees in North America, about 28% of those species are threatened or endangered, some kind of status. Butterflies, there's a paper came out earlier this year, so 22% decline in butterfly abundance over the last, this is from 2000 to 2020, I think. That's something to be worried about. And when we talk about abundance, that just means the total number of butterflies. I don't care what species they are. Okay, so it's not the same thing as saying we have a 22% decline in species. If you just look at pollinator species in general, something like 40% are, you know, maybe facing extinction. That's the concern, and that's, you know, coming out of papers and such. Even something like tiger beetles, nice, beautiful beetles. They got a lot of different subspecies. They're great hunters. Okay, so you want them in your yard if you have any kind of garden going on. But anyway, 1/3 of those species and subspecies are considered to be threatened and at risk. Now, so, you know, the picture doesn't look good, but it's not the end of the world yet. We got to, you know, do the right things, and that's partly why you're out here, is to learn, you know, what can you do in terms of habitat and things like that. So we look at what we consider pollinators. There's 6 insect orders that are considered pollinators. Okay, so, 5 orders. Butterflies and moths, they're from the same order, Lepidoptera. Wasps and, 4 orders. Wasps and bees, hymenopterans, and flies and beetles. Okay, all these things do some pollination. When you get and look into the details of that, you have what, you know, I consider to be incidental pollinators for the most part. And so what do I mean by that? Well, when we want something pollinated, what does that require? Okay. If I've got a plant over here, seaside daisy, as I talked about earlier, and I've got another one over here, and let's say that I've got to move pollen, what do I have to have? I've got to have an animal that will go from that plant over to that plant, right? if it goes from this plant and then visits an apple tree, or God knows what else is out there, right? What's it going to do? Right? The pollen has to be from the same species. So that's why I say incidental. A butterfly, famous for kind of flitting around from one place to the other, so not a great pollinator. Although, if you look at monarchs, there's evidence that during migration times over these big cotton fields in Texas and areas like that, that they actually contribute to pollination of those crops. Okay? It's just that in general, they're not a great pollinator. Beetles be the same thing, but a lot of times there's certain beetles that'll go on to types of flowers, and that's where they procreate. Okay. What else? Flies. Flies, typically you don't think of them as being pollinators, but for carrot-type plants, the Apiaceae, they can be very important pollinators for those plants. So, you know, I talked about moving things from one plant to the same plant. That's something that's called flower constancy. What that means is, as the name implies, they have a tendency to go from one type of flower to the next type of flower. So what animals do that? Well, bees are really good at doing that. Okay, there's I don't want to say a rare wasp, but an uncommon wasp called a pollen wasp, and you can find them up in the mountains. They also go from, they stick with the same kind of flower. But for the most part, wasps don't do that. So, you know, this is a point where you start focusing down and saying, you know, what are our efficient pollinators? And bees happen to do that. But there's one more group I haven't talked about yet, and that's the moths. And moths, when I first started giving this presentation, we kind of, you know, didn't say much other than, yeah, well, all these things here, they don't do that great a job, so let's concentrate on bees. And there's been a lot of studying been done in the last 20 years or so, and moths are we're becoming aware of how important they are in certain, like, natural ecosystems. There are certainly there are flowers that open up at night. There's others that are open day and night, but they rely on moths for at least a contribution to their pollination. There's evidence that certain crops benefit from moths, and there's a paper out of the southeast on apple crops that talked about the contribution that moths make to pollination of apples. So, you know, moths have been very understudied, and I think we'll learn more and more. There's a concept called a pollination network, and what that means is, you know, I've got a bunch of plants and I've got a bunch of potential pollinators and species of pollinators. Typically it'd be species of bees, and I want to know, you know, there's a network, you know, bee A goes to 3 different plants, and the second kind of bee goes to 2 of those and another one, and you get this crisscrossing network. And as you add more and more species and more plants into that network in a natural ecosystem, what you do is you create a more resilient ecosystem. So if something bad happens, you have a better chance that that ecosystem survives and recovers from something. You know, be that a fire or a big storm that knocks a bunch of stuff out, people that do bad things, you've got this chance. And even something like climate change, which is a slow rolling thing, the more resiliency you have in your ecosystem, the better the chances that you can survive the worst things that might be coming your way. There are 7 families of bees in the world. Here in North America, we have 6 of those families. One of them is only found around Australia, I don't know, maybe New Zealand. In terms of number of species, we have somewhere between 20 and 25,000 species. We're still finding them, 20 and 25,000 species of bees in the world. And unfortunately here, we really don't have a lot of species diversity in bees. When you get this close to the coast, talking about you're pushing closer and closer to this kind of maritime area. And the reason for that is, if you'll allow me to digress a little bit, I warned you. So maybe 250 years ago, we didn't have North America and South America and Europe and all this stuff. We had something called Pangea back at that time. It was a single continent. And that thing started to break up around 250 million years ago. Basically went into a couple main pieces. One of those was called Gondwana land. You may have heard of this somewhere. And one of them was called Laurasia. So Gondwana land, for the most part, is Africa and South America lumped together. And, the current thinking, there's a paper came out, I think, last year on this, is that is where bees evolved. So somewhere around 125 million years ago is when our first angiosperms appeared. And we know that number very accurately because they leave pollen. And pollen leaves a good fossil record. And you can look at pollen, you can tell what it is that you're looking at. So 125 million years ago, angiosperms appear. And at the same time, we start, within 5 million years or so, is what the studies suggest. Bees, the earliest ancestor of bees were there. Now, the earliest ancestor of bees was a wasp, a solitary hunting wasp. And bees are wasps, okay? Just like butterflies are moths. And interestingly enough, butterflies diverged from moths at about the same time. They took advantage of a new niche, which is flowering plants. And bees are just wasps that became vegetarian to take advantage of those flowering plants. So that's how that goes. So anyway, that was a really dry, warm environment where they evolved 125 million years ago. So this is, Africa and South America. Somewhere around 100 million years ago, those two continents broke apart. And the earlier evolving families would have been on both of those. And the later evolving families maybe only evolved on one of those. And that kind of feeds into what we see out in the world in terms of where these families are at. And that's why that seventh family is not here in North America. Because it was a late evolver when that was going on. So think about this. Historically, we've got these bees, and they liked desert, basically. And they evolved, they speciated, and then they move around over time, millions of years, and they come to Oregon, and they say, holy crap, it's cold out here. The flowers are not blooming all the time. I need to feed my kids, and there's nothing out there to do that with, so they have a hard time. And it really is true. And the closer to the water you get, man, the fewer species of bees you're going to find. If you go 15 miles inland up into the mountains, there's a whole heck of a lot more diversity of bees. Okay, so that's the worst of the nerdy parts. So sorry about that. Now I want to talk, before we can talk about habitat, it's really important to understand what the bee needs are in terms of habitat. And so we look at bee nesting. Bees, the majority of bees actually nest in the ground. Somewhere around 90% are solitary. 70% are ground nesters. If they don't nest in the ground, they'll probably be cavity nesters. And that can be broken down into what's called renters commonly. And so a renter is like us. If we're renting an apartment, they find a nice little cavity somewhere in the side of a building or wood or whatever, and they go and build their nest in there. if you the other option, though, is some of those cavity-dwelling bees will actually create their own cavity. And so there are bees that take advantage of plants that have pithy stems. Everybody knows that's kind of a soft interior. And they'll hollow those out, and they'll make a long tunnel, and they'll start building nest cells. They go and get pollen, and they provision those nest cells, lay an egg on them, close it off, and then they come further up. So you can imagine maybe a stem that has 10 different nest cells in it. The first one started at the very inside, and then she works her way out and has these cells that will hopefully produce adults. So those are things that we need to think about, and I'll talk about that more. Another thing is just the life cycles of bees. The solitary bees, the majority of those are out for a short period of time. The adult bees, maybe they use the figure 3 or 4 weeks. Now, that's just a generalized number. There's a whole lot of stuff that we don't know because it's very hard to do field observations on these things. So there's a lot of things we don't know, but we do know that sometimes, instead of 3 or 4 weeks, that if the weather's bad, a bee will just wait. Okay, so I forgot to mention this, but these are all solitary, they're all females, right? The males have one purpose in life as far as bees are concerned, and that's reproduction. Other than that, they're useless. See, even that's not really true, but we don't have time to go into that. This is the problem, generalizations. Everything I say, I can think of some, but there's this. There is floral specialization that we need to think about in terms of bees. And so if you look at bees, generally they break into 2 categories. There's something that we call generalist bees and specialist, and that refers to the use of pollen. So a generalist bee can take and use pollen from many different plants, and they use that pollen to feed their larvae, right? So I told you about this stem, this hypothetical stem with nest cells. Well, when they go and gather pollen, they'll make multiple trips. When they get back, and they'll build a ball, basically, of pollen. Some people call it pollen loaves. This ball of pollen has maybe a little bit of honey, nectar mixed in with it. And so that pollen, some plants it's toxic. And so what we end up having is certain plants that a generalist bee maybe can't go and take pollen off of, even though they are capable of a wide variety. But more commonly, we've got these specialized bees that actually have evolved to be able to tolerate the toxicity in the pollen. And this is not unlike monarch butterfly caterpillars being able to eat milkweed, right? So when they eat milkweed, they get something called cardenolides. It's a compound that builds up in them, and that's what stays with them and makes them poisonous to, say, a bird or something like that tries to eat those caterpillars. So there's a plant called a death camas, as an example, which is really poisonous. Don't eat the tubers on that thing. And there is one bee, a mining bee, that's capable of tolerating the pollen on a death camas. So we need, when we think about habitat and flowers, I'm going to say this later, but I'll say it now, and I'll say it later, and Darcy will say it, because it's really important. Diversity. Natives, if at least 60-70% residentially and more out in a big area. Natives and diverse plants. That's what you want to have. That's how you get the largest diversity of bees and other invertebrates that have grown up, that have co-evolved with those plants. Another thing that comes into play is the social organization of bees. Now, I mentioned the word solitary. That's pretty obvious, right? If one bee doing the thing. Then sometimes 2 or 3 bees females will work together. And you get into these grades of, well, are they social? Yeah, they're kind of social. And then you look at something like a bumblebee, and they come up with a term called eusocial, which means true social. And the main point there is that when you look at a bumblebee or any other eusocial bees, there's actually a physical distinction of some kind. It might just be size, or it could be something else, so that you know, oh, that's a queen and this is a worker, right? And then finally you get to, and so that's kind of a primitively eusocial bumblebee. And some of the ground nesting bees besides bumblebees, some of the little things that sweat bees, any of you took those cards, we've got social bees of, little tiny things like this or even smaller. And then you get into what's called truly eusocial, which are like a honeybee. Some of the other bees, the ground nesters, are eusocial bees, some things that we don't have in this area, stingless bees. And they are much more different. So that if you ever seen a honeybee queen, it's, this giant egg layer is basically all it is, right? And the workers you can tell apart, and etc. So these eusocial and semi-social and all the other kinds of social, they tend to have longer life cycles in their colonies, maybe multi-year. So these tend to last longer. So that's going to bring up something that we need to think about in terms of what we're planning, and Darcy's going to talk about this, is just flower phenology. When are they out? Okay. So a bumblebee colony, as an example, they're out late winter, early spring, and that colony doesn't senesce until maybe this time of year or so, maybe another month, but I'm not seeing any workers out really anymore, so that colony's kind of shot. But there's others that will go on into the next year. And so you need to have bloom. You need to have flowers over a long period of time. And that's something that you have to consider when you're thinking about your habitat. If you want to learn more, a really good resource is a book called Bees in Your Backyard. Some of you are probably familiar with this book. It's a good place for a general person to go into. Some of the stuff's kind of technical, but that's okay. That's how you learn. And it's got a lot of great information in it. And so I would suggest that. The other thing, if you're even more interested in finding things out and getting involved in maybe helping conserve bees, then there's a program called Bee Advocate. And if you just do a Google search on OSU extension Bee Advocate, you'll find some links. It doesn't cost anything. There's some training involved. It's pretty minimal, but enough to get you to understand bees a bit more. And then you can actually get materials to hand out at some kind of an outreach event or something like that. And then if you're just like a real nerd bird and you want to go further, then go look at the Master Melitologist program. Okay, so let's go into some of these habitat requirements, and some of this will be a repeat. But when we look at flowers, we want to have not just a diversity of species, or I guess what I should say is species diversity is hopefully bringing you some things here, which like colors. Okay. Bees are sensitive to certain colors, and they tend to like certain colors of plants. Interesting, like red, for instance. Okay, bees really can't see red very well. And I always tell people, if you're going to pick a red plant, just hang out in the nursery for a while and look at it and see if it's being visited by bees. Because that would suggest that there's ultraviolet markings on a lot of these red flowers. And so even though the bees aren't really sensitive to red, they can see these markings and zoom in on where they need to go. When you look at flowers, there's the shape, the flower morphology, right? The shapes of those flowers. You take the corolla, the depth of the corolla, the width of the corolla. And then, it gets complicated because if you look at bees, there are bees with short tongues. There's a taxonomic description, which I'm going to ignore. But physically short tongues. There's a corolla that's a half an inch long, and the nectaries are at the back of that corolla. And you've got a bee with a 1/4 inch long tongue. What happens?
Stars.
It can't get to the nectar, right? Does everybody agree that that'd be a problem? Well, no, not necessarily.
No.
Because how wide is the corolla? A little bee can just crawl right in there and get it. And so there's a little bees called a masked bee, is a name, Hylaeus, which, they're maybe, they're less than a half an inch. A huge one would be a half an inch long. And typically could be, a 1/4 of an inch. And, I've been out swatting, doing collecting, and you hit some flowers, and all of a sudden it's like, I got 5 bees in this thing that I wasn't even going for. Well, they were hidden inside of the corollas and knocked them out. So it's not so easy, right? So long tongue, short tongue, how wide's the corolla, etc. The big old fat bee cannot get in maybe to that corolla. And then there's some bees that even cheat. And carpenter bees are one. And they'll go down to the base of the corolla on the outside of the flower, drill a hole right through it, stick their tongue in there. So there are, even things like the pollen nutritional value. Pollen's not all the same. Pollen's got protein in it, carbohydrates, some lipids, fats, but it varies with the plants. It can even vary at the time of year. And so there's a paper that has just come out looking at, there's actually these changing requirements of, say, something like a bumblebee colony, that at one time of the colony development, they're looking for protein-rich sources. Later on, they're looking for carbohydrate-rich sources. And so how do you provide both of those? Diversity, right? So there's, diversity. We don't know all the reasons why diversity is good. We just know that it's good, and we've got the data. Resins, some plants are resinous, sticky, because some bees, and I didn't mention this, some bees build little nests using stones and things like that, and they stick them together with resin. And they might put them in a branch of a bush or something like that. And it might only be, a half an inch long. And this bee will go out and gather all these little pebbles and cement them together, and that's her nest. So resinous plants can be part of your mix. And trichomes. Trichomes are the hairs on a plant. So anybody's familiar with lamb's ear, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that fuzz. There's bees that use that fuzz to line the inside of their nest. And we've got a coastal native here called Anthidium paliventri that likes to use coastal buckwheat, because coastal buckwheat leaves have got that fuzz on them. And I've got some in my yard, and I see every year where they're scraping. I've got pictures of one scraping the fuzz off, and then they bundle it up and carry it back to their nest. So these are all things that are brought about through having a diversity of plants. When you look at management of habitat, when you're pruning, if in a natural area you're not going to prune, but around your place or something, the way you prune is important because you can have habitat for stem nesting bees if you do things properly. Leaves, a really important part of habitat, leaf management. So if you look, just very simply, maybe a species of moth is going to go and lay an egg up in the tree on a leaf somewhere. And its caterpillars are going to be chomping away, and then finally when they get ready, something like a silk moth, they'll go and actually kind of they'll use their silk and pull some leaves together, and then they'll pupate in there. Not pupate, but they'll create a cocoon in there. Pupate sometime later, but over winter, if it's a deciduous tree, that'll fall to the ground. And so if it's the fall and you go and rake all your leaves and throw them in a burning barrel, what happens? It's gone. And it's not just, that's just one example. There's all kinds of invertebrates that do things like that. This is a very important part of your management. And there's this leave the leaves. Water, that's something that we need to think about. Not all bees are really dependent on that, but we've got some species that really use it. Osmia species, mason bees, they use mud to seal off and make walls separating those little chambers I talked about, the cells. So they need water for that. And then there's different kinds of wasps that you've probably seen. That mud daubers for one, but they're building their nest, either the whole structure out of mud or they're using them for closures. Butterflies, they like to have mud because they get minerals and things out of that mud. So providing something like that is a good thing to think about. If you look at more generalized invertebrates, if you've got a downed log or you're taking a tree down, bury one end of that log 2 or 3 inches in the ground, leave it horizontal, pile some stuff up around it. One thing to do when you're, thinking about habitat is think like a bug, right? Think like a bug. Like, get yourself down into I'm this big, right? And, man, this would be a great little hiding place here. No bird's going to eat me if I get in there, right? So you got to think like a bug in order to examine your habitat. We have a tendency, all of us, to we're up here and we're not looking down here. And it's a problem for even bee collectors like me when we're out. It's like you don't pay attention to the little flowers and things like that. So think like a bug. Go to page 4, and this is a checklist of actions, things you can do that might help improve will help improve your habitat, right? And so, go down there, broken into 4 areas, landscaping type things. And we're not going to go through this list. You can do that on your own. But as an example, if you look, you'll see it's outlined spring, summer, fall. Why is that? Because we want seasonal coverage, right, on that landscaping part. Lawn and yard care. I didn't really have time to go into lawns. I mean, I love to go on a rant about lawns, but I didn't have time. But things that you can do there. If you are a gardener, like vegetables or fruit garden, there's specific things that you do and can get points for when you're doing an assessment. And then finally, for this kind of thing, especially if it's, say your yard, your acreage, whatever, there's a community action section that asks for more than just habitat per se, but what are you doing to help conserve these animals? Okay. And so if you go to the next page, just flip over. You don't even have to flip over. It should be the other side there, page 5. You'll see that you're going to score your site. And scoring is in 4 sections. You've got foraging, habitat, nesting habitat, what are your pesticide practices, and then, as I said, community action. And there's maximum scores you can get for these. I think altogether it's 225. There's a recommendation somewhere. You should strive to get at least 180 points. But the purpose of this assessment isn't just to go out and do an assessment one time. The purpose is to determine a score and then go and repeat this after you've made some improvements to your habitat. Maybe every year, maybe every couple of years. And I want to make a couple of comments here. If you go down to the bottom of that page, you'll see foraging habitat. And there's actually, I think, 3 sections, 1A, B, and C. And you'll see when you look at 1A, it's going to say what percentage of the site is composed of flowering vegetation. Now, you don't have to go and get a map and lay out a ruler and figure it out to the 0.5%, right? Just be consistent. We're not making a lunar rover module here, right? We're trying to improve habitat. The main thing is do it the same way so that you can see relative improvement. It doesn't matter if your score is 180 or 160, as long as you're doing it the same way and you can see improvement. So when you get to those, just, feel free to just eyeball it, but just always eyeball it the same way. So the same thing goes on 1B. Here we're not just looking at how much flowering vegetation, but we're going to look at for the amount of natives that are there. And again, I don't have time to go through this. It's fairly straightforward, but what percentage of cover is natives? Again, make a guess. Make it as good a guess as you can make it, but just always be consistent. And there's certain features that you'll get points for. And I'll just go through one of these, but the very first one under 1C here, you'll see they're going to give you up to 10 points for, if you've got a little native prairie patch, rain gardens, other kind of wildflower plantings, you get, pick up 10 points, and there's other ways to pick up points. And, that really feeds back to the very beginning when I talked about ways to improve your scores, right? And we'll just skip over the rest of that. Section 2, which is on page 8, so this is where we're going into looking at our nesting and overwintering habitat and what kind of things you've done to, create some good habitat. And so I mentioned ground nesting bees. Well, no surprise. If you have patches of bare ground, etc., that make it easier for a ground nesting bee to actually make a nest, you get some points for that. And there's suggestions on how you can do this. Bunch grasses are really great, and they're mentioned in here because bees don't need a lot of room. You don't need something as big as these areas of ground here. You don't need something like this. Bees can find a little spot between 2 big clumps of bunch grass or sedge and go and make their little holes and dig those burrows down. There are, again, if you go, say, over to page 9, you're going to see pictures here, and these kind of correspond to some of the things that I told you about cavity nesters. And you can see that these are what's being talked about. These are what you're going to get points for if you provide these kind of features in your habitat. Pesticide practices, really goes back to Xerces' whole philosophy on pesticides is don't use them if you can manage to not use them. Otherwise, be very sparing, and the points roll out along those lines. And then community action is just, what are you doing? Are you putting up signs? Are you going out? You're trying to educate your neighbors, things like that. So again, no rocket science here. Just be consistent. If you have a little bit larger landscape that you're dealing with, there is an assessment guide for natural areas and rangelands. And the best way to find that is you go to xerces.org, the website. There's a resources on the ribbon. It says resources. If you click on that, you'll see publications library. And once you land on that page, just do a search for habitat assessment. Just put that in the search box. You'll see these habitat guides. So again, it's natural areas and rangelands assessment. And so here you're assessing over 5 categories. Community action's not part of it. And it's things that are more applicable to how you're managing these larger landscapes.
I want to talk about the ancestors that practiced stewardship on this land. They were so in tune with the species and what was going on in the cycles. And today I want to use the cycle of the seasons, as Dave mentioned. The 4 seasons are a way to organize tasks and thinking as you're developing your habitat. And actually I would recommend getting a calendar specifically for that and putting some of these tasks that probably need to happen onto your calendar, so you kind of are setting goals for yourself. The fall right now, let's just start with now. The light is changing. The sun's lower in the sky. It's behind the forest in some cases, and the shade opportunities have increased. If you're keeping plants in pots, that's really important. Little birds are eating nutlets on the wax myrtles. If you have wax myrtles, you'll know they make a waxy little nut. It's not a real nut, but they call them nutlets. And they're, in many cases, masting this year. So there's a lot of food for these little birds that are coming in. So they're also eating, and I'm seeing some of this here. Cascara, elderberry, Pacific crabapple, serviceberry, twinberry, red and evergreen huckleberry, and salal. And keep that calendar handy as you find more things, as you see things. If you see a bird eating something, make a note, because I think we could add to this list pretty easily. So seed collection for yourself, if you want to grow some of the native things you can find going to seed, this is a really good time to be out there collecting. Hopefully you were walking around this summer and you saw it blooming. Oh my gosh, there's some Lupin littoralis blooming at the beach, and you want to collect some of that. Now might be the time. Although with lupin you got to time it so close, because when they unravel, they pop and those seeds go dispersal. So seeds have strategies. Plants have strategies of dispersal. Wind is a common one, but this throw your seeds everywhere is pretty cool too. So you're collecting seeds for you, but somebody else is also using those seeds for food. And it's usually a tiny little insect that burrows into the seed. I learned this the hard way. Opened up my bag of seeds and they were all hollow. And who knows where the insect had gone. So I like to collect into paper bags for the because you don't want humidity. And if you have a sealed bag and there's any kind of temperature change, you could get moisture, which will germinate a seed easily. So I collect into paper bags, and then I add something really smelly, pennyroyal or mint or something. Insects breathe through their abdomen basically, and they absorb the strong smell of that, and they just are repelled by it. So keep them from eating your seeds until you're able to plant them. This is also the time of year now to collect your cuttings. If you're going to make cuttings of almost any flowering shrub, I'm going to leave out the Ericaceae family, the huckleberry, the rhododendrons. Those are azaleas, super hard to do from cuttings. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I don't try it. And there's so many that are easy to do. And one of the things we want to do when we're making habitat is make more. And nobody wants to have to buy 50 of something, but if you have 100 feet where you could plant something and you can grow them from cuttings, then you've just saved yourself a whole bunch of money. So maybe buy 3 plants that you know you're going to take cuttings from, and then you'll build on that as time goes by, your assessment every year or every couple of years. So if you're going to have bulbs, camas, tiger lily, one of the brodeas, but maybe you know where there's a patch of camas, or you have a patch and you want to spread them around, dig them up now and hold on to them until you're ready to plant. So conversely, anything you don't want more of, you need to be eliminating it before it drops seed. Even though burdock is a good plant, or curly dock or yellow dock, whichever it is that we have, it's a good plant for a lot of reasons. For us, trying to create habitat is a problem. So my job right now is to go around and try to get all those seed heads and remove them. I would never put them in a compost pile. So don't let stuff go to seed if that's not what you want. That's the time to make sure you mow. If you've got a pollinator garden, I would say mow that once a year. Although there's a lot of good stuff to leave standing. You can see from the other side of my parking lot, I leave a lot of stuff to go. And I know the birds will be here this winter eating those seeds. And so those are tasks you can put on your calendar or plan for in your planting. I'm going to plant 3 things that I can take cuttings from and start to create a hedgerow. It takes time and planning, you know that. We talked about the cardboard and mulch last time as laying a foundation for these plants to go in later. And so that's planning. Use your calendar. Make a calendar specifically for this. The bee housing I want to talk about, some of what Dave said too, but we create challenges when we try to manage animals. It's in our nature to be careful and considerate and nurturing, but we create problems by giving them a house when in the wild they're moving around looking for the appropriate type of solitary house or something. We give them a house and expect them to come back every year and use that house. We'd better be cleaning it and making sure there aren't pathogens that are transferring over. So you know the honeybee story and how much trouble they're in. And there's so many things, fungus and virus and mites. So in the wild, the honeybees would swarm and take off and go find a new tree that there weren't honeybees already living in. And then there'd be another swarm, and those would always be moving. They wouldn't be residential. And when we have them living in a little house, we become responsible for things that we can't even see. So what's happening to them in the hives, the collapse disorder, is some of it is very well researched, and some of it we're still learning. So when humans manage animals, it becomes dicey for the animals if we're unaware of certain things. So the hollow stems that Dave talked about is the bee housing that I think we should try to aim for, is their natural bee housing. And so the stems are far enough apart that there's no transfer of disease this way, and it makes it hard for a predator to hunt them because they have to visit a bunch of different places. So the pathogens can't spread as well, so there's a lot of protection for them. But also that stem's got a shelf life, pretty short shelf life. Maybe it'll get used 2 years, and then it'll be decomposing. So there's things that we can do to create these hollow stems and make it even more accessible. It does require longer term planning, but you can see on my page, first I've listed the elderberry, the goldenrod, the cow parsley, the angelica, the milkweed, and the sunflowers. There are other pithy hollow plants. I just couldn't think of them in time to put them on here. If you know of any, please share with me. Oh, this one is definitely hollow. So let's look at what it would look like the first year you're going to do this. Say you've got some elderberry or some of these other plants. You're going to cut those stems back 12 to 18 inches high. Smooth cut is important, apparently, because it's more attractive to a bee. I wouldn't know that if I didn't read it. There's no way I could know what a bee prefers, except somebody else figured this out. So they make a nice smooth cut with a sharp tool. And you can use those cuttings to start new plants, oftentimes. So now you go this year 2, your cavity nesting bees are finding these hollow stems for their nests, and you're just going to leave them up. You don't care what the neighbors think anymore, or the neighbors can't see you. You're working for the bees. So you're going to leave them up. Certain species can produce brood in late summer. I guess more than one brood in a year. For some bees, some species. But also during year 2, cut those hollow stems back again. Some of them, not all of them maybe. Because you want some to flower next year. And flowers on woody shrubs come on last year's wood. So if you cut all the stems, there's going to be no flowers next year. Just cut maybe a third or a fourth, or, it depends on the size of your plant, I suppose. So you're cutting them back, and then in year 3, the bees that are using those first ones that you cut are going to show up, and some of them will use the stems from the second year that you cut. And now you're on a roll. Now you got something going. But this is a maintenance thing that you want to do every year if possible. And if it's on a calendar for you, you might have a chance to remember. I know we all get really busy in the fall winterizing, but this could just be part of the routine. So late fall is also an excellent time to start a hedgerow, particularly with any of those plant species we mentioned above. So when you're starting a hedgerow, what are your limits? So you're limited by how much sunlight. Is it dry or is it wet? Can you use trees? Or does it have a height limit? Or maybe it's under the power lines. Maybe the municipality came and mowed under the power lines and told you can't have trees there. Well, hedgerows are not ever going to get as tall as a tree. So is there going to be trees in your hedgerow? That's a personal decision. There's so many flowering trees. Cascara and elderberry, and which is actually a shrub, but can get as big as a tree. So you would lay those in early, because as the tree gets larger, it provides shade for maybe a more diverse planting of other species. So after the trees and shrubs, maybe they're 1 or 2 years into it, then start laying in your perennials and maybe making places you can scatter some annual seed and your bulbs. So you're working from the highest plant outward so that your mix, there's room for your mix. And we know in the wild, in the woods or around here, we see these plants growing like this, so close together. So what we don't see is 2 species growing really close together. You see a variety that play really well together. And so they're not taking the same thing from the ground at the same time. Their needs vary. Their flower time varies, which means the one that needs all the energy right then will take it, and the others will wait. And so they're able to live side by side in very close density in a thicket-like behavior. That is where the best shelter is, and shelter is a huge part of habitat. But also, the hedgerow is going to provide food for a bunch of them. Again, a bunch of good habitat. It's also going to build up things underneath, leaves and debris that will harbor little worms and bugs and beetles, so that the birds that eat those things are able to forage. You see them going around in the leaves at the edge of the woods. So at the edge of your hedgerow will be a habitat for ground feeders. So you've got all kinds of things provided just by this hedgerow. It's one of the very best shelter things you can do. Europe's been using them for a long, long time. America is late to the party on a lot of things. We had so much habitat for so long. So the people that are really discovering hedgerows right now are the vineyards of California. They're using them as their perimeter planting because they attract so many good pollinators. Honeybees, they're not native and they're not a great pollinator. The pollinators that do buzz sonification, where they vibrate, do an excellent job of pollinating a lot of things that honeybees get hired to do. The farmers hire the hives, and so the bees travel a lot, and it's a hard life for what those bees have to go through. So leaving the spider webs up, we're going to go down to that habitat. Now we're talking about your house, your fence, garage, and old building. If you can leave the spider webs up, there are little insects that are caught in there. The hummingbirds and the other little birds will eat those. The dead of winter, when it's so cold, that's what they're going to forage and find some proteins for that. You all have a chart, and it's really important to notice these yellows. The yellow areas on this chart are when there are no flowers for bees, and you're like, so what is this? Is before early. We're talking about January, February, March. You're like, wait a minute, there's daffodils and tulips, and wait a minute, those aren't natural flowers, those are human-bred flowers, and they don't offer very much at all. They're beautiful for us, but they're not feeding the pollinators. So you are looking for plants like meadow foam, which is incredibly easy to grow from seed, to be an early pollinator for something like mason bees. Sea blush, tidy tips, baby blue eyes, those are all early ones. So I'm not saying this chart is exactly accurate. Dave lives in Brookings. These things are going to bloom maybe 3 weeks earlier in Brookings than they're going to bloom here. And then Coos Bay is maybe even behind that. So latitude has a lot to do with it. As you go north, you see things blooming in a sequence. So, and I was hoping that maybe these species that are on here would help some of you if you're trying to decide what species do I want. These are all pretty much tried and true good flowering species that do well around here. So now we're to winter. Fall was long. There was a lot to do, which is true. And now we're at winter. Planting, pruning, planting. Use that calendar. And I feel like I need to talk about birdhouses because people want to encourage birds. They want to have that habitat. And that it's our attempt to nurture again. And we provide this little house. If we're going to do that, if we're going to go that route, make sure the hole is the size of the birds you want. It's extremely specific. They seem to know the difference between a 1 1/4 inch and 1 3/16 to have that right. I mean, the birds care. They care a lot because if they choose the wrong hole, there'll be a predator coming after their eggs. And if you put a little perch outside, that kind of invites a predator to sit there and try to get them. So they know how to get in and out. They're way more agile than we can give them credit for. So if you do use a house, make sure you would clean them at the end of the season. But birds can raise more than one brood too. So you really got to watch and be an observer. The National Wildlife Federation website, you'll find it, and it'll give you lots of recommendations on specifically by species for what size for what birds. Other than that, I would say put out, if you brush your dog and you got a lot of hair early spring, put that out, or your horse or your cat. We're going to transplant plants to a new location after December 21st. That's the shortest day of the year, and we want to reduce the stress that light puts on making a plant do photosynthesis. So we wait until the very shortest time of the year. I would say winter solstice on halfway through January. It's a narrow window, especially for the Ericaceae families, the huckleberry and the rhodies. If you can get them to go at all, it's going to be that time of year that they can handle it. Transplanting is you've dug it up, and its roots have been doing what they wanted for a long time. Stratifying the seeds, if you've gathered some seeds and you're wanting to grow them, and you can put them in some kind of a shallow starting tray, have them on the north side of your house where there's no direct sun, and just keep them safe by covering them with some kind of protection, because squirrels and birds will both try to dig in there and find bugs or whatever. The propagation of tiny seeds, they need light. So a lot of times when we plant a packet of seeds, particularly annuals, which are known to be mostly tiny, don't bury them, don't rake them in. You just put them on top of the ground, bare dirt, they can't grow in mulch, and then pack them in. And so that's pretty important. So storm cleanup, save your storm cleanup. Make your habitat piles that we talked about last class. Use that lichen, hang on to it for spring. The birds, you'll find it woven into their nests so beautifully. In spring, now we're getting less and less to do. So things should be up and growing. If you can provide wet spot in the ground near a dripping faucet or something, you will see bees gathering there, because they're gathering the mud or the minerals. Either they need mud for nests or they need minerals, especially the males in the pollinator species often need the minerals to carry their reproduction out. Perennials can be planted into May if you're going to water. Hydroseeding is for a larger area. If you guys know what hydroseeding is, they shoot it out in a slurry out of a fire hose and cover a wide area with mulch with seed embedded in it. And there's a company called Clean Rivers that does that. They'll only do it in a narrow window in March and September. So you really got to be prepared and ready for them if you're going to seed your land that way. Pruning back your flowering shrubs. Take no more than 1/3. Add mulch around the plants that get lots of sun. A lot of times it's the heat in the ground that is causing problems for the roots of the plant, not just dormancy. So now we're to summer. So water or no water, there's no black and white answers. We can generalize all day. We just cannot say it's either this way or that way, because there's too many variables. The range of tolerance of native plants is huge. And they'll flower more if you put them in the sun, but watering is very specific to the species. I've seen both wax myrtle and ceanothus killed by water in the summer. All those little microbes, all those little people that are supporting them in the ground, and that nitrogen fixing is completely upset by that wet cycle coming at the wrong time of year. So it's really important to know your species and respect it. With waterfalls or bird baths, I love this idea. I wish I had a little waterfall. They need to be shallow. The only bees that really drink water, I think, are honeybees that make honey. That's what I've heard anyway. The other bees get their moisture from nectar mostly. But the ones making mud, for whatever reason, need that wet soil. So you can provide that for them. So start scoping out seed collection plants ahead of time. It's summertime. That's when we should be walking around going, that's going to be making seed in 4 weeks or 6 weeks. You got to kind of guess, unless you can see it every day. It's in your own yard. Scope it out, put it on your calendar to remind you, because once it's not flowering, it doesn't catch our attention. Get on the map for Homegrown National Park. That is a movement, whether you're into it or not, eventually that will be counted. The Homegrown National Park is a national movement that has the firefly as their iconic mascot, which leaves the Pacific Northwest out. I guess we have fireflies, but they don't glow. So to our children that grow up here, it's a mythical creature, right? It's like a unicorn. Are they real? You know, I wish they would add another mascot, that the bumblebee or something that was really relevant here. And but if you get on the map, eventually, I don't know, is it 20 million acres of lawn? They're trying to eliminate 20 million acres of the 65 million acres of lawn that we have in the United States, using fertilizers and pesticides and all those things that really aren't helpful to a healthy ecosystem. So get on the map. It's free. It's easy. Stillwater Natives is on the map. And then you too can be counted. And eventually, politically, it might be the bees have all of us as an advocate. So thanks for supporting wildlife and biodiversity.